covenant circumcision. The concept of circumcision has been a part of human culture and religious practices for thousands of years, particularly within the context of Hebrew roots, Judaism and Christianity. At its core, circumcision is a physical act that involves the removal of the foreskin from the male reproductive organ. In the scriptural narrative, circumcision was first introduced as a sign of the covenant between Alahim and Abraham, marking the beginning of a long history that intertwines with the faith of Israel. Within Christianity, the necessity of circumcision for believers has been a topic of heated debate. Some argue that it remains a required practice under the new covenant, citing certain scriptural passages that they believe mandate its continuation. On the other hand, many contend that with the coming of Messiah and the establishment of the new covenant, physical circumcision is no longer a requirement for deliverance. This difference in belief stems from varying interpretations of Scripture. For instance, Paul wrote extensively on the subject, arguing that true circumcision is a spiritual one, not a physical act, emphasizing that what matters is the circumcision of the heart, or a divine heart operation, which is a concept rooted in Deuteronomy and also echoed in the New Covenant. This contention surrounding circumcision today largely revolves around understanding the New Covenant and what it is. Some see it as a fulfillment and continuation of the Old Covenant practices, while others view it as a significant departure, rendering previous physical rituals obsolete. Understanding the spiritual perspective, though, allows believers to see that Yahusha's intention behind the new covenant is to establish a direct, personal relationship with each individual, not to continue a physical practice as a prerequisite for belief. So let's look at the actual rite of circumcision. The first thing we consider is the rite of circumcision. Although in these days it is not such an issue, it very much was in the early assembly. Great religious significance was attached to it. In Acts chapter 15, the great Jerusalem council met together over this very matter. Many from Judah had followed Paul and caused great confusion among the Gentile assemblies by saying that the Gentiles could not be delivered except they were circumcised after the manner of Moses. They also taught them to keep the law of Moses as writ. The assembly in Galatia were especially bewitched by these religious teachers of the Old Covenant law. In his letter, Paul had to deal with the matter of circumcision quite a lot. The issue, as will be seen, is great covenantal confusion, and the answer, of course, is found in the torture stake of our Master, Yahusha Messiah. So where did circumcision come from? Let's look at this covenant given to Abraham. In Genesis 17, we have the details of the rite of circumcision as given to Abraham. In fact, even Stephen, in his speech before the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 7, he spoke of it as the covenant of circumcision. So we consider the important details of this covenant of circumcision from the book of Genesis. In Genesis 17, in the BRS, we read, about 15 years prior, Yahuwah established his first covenant with Abram by cutting up several animals and he himself passing through them like a burning torch while Abram was in a deep sleep. Well, now we come to Genesis 17. 13 years after the birth of Ishmael, Yahuwah Alahim appeared to Abram once again, saying, I'm Yahuwah El Shaddai, which means the strong, sufficient Alahim of the mountain. So come walk before me and behave perfectly. I'm raising up my blood covenant with you again, son, and no longer will you be known as Abram, which means exalted father. For I'm changing your name to Abraham, which means father of many. Now it's time to begin increasing your family so that you become the father of nations. Yes, kings and priests shall come from your loins, and my blood covenant of deliverance will be for all these generations too. For I'm giving your descendants all this land of Canaan as an eternal inheritance, and I'll reign over all of them, blessing and protecting them. And after changing Abram's name, Yahuwah refreshed his blood covenant with Abraham again, saying, "This blood covenant between me and you has terms now, Abraham, and involves the seed from your loins. And so, animal blood will not seal the deal here anymore, for this is far too important. So much so that you and all the men in your household, whether slave or free, are to circumcise the flesh of their foreskins and be partakers in this shedding of blood, as a sign of my blood covenant with you. Every male child born in your household is to be circumcised after 8 days. For any male found in your household that is not showing the sign of my blood covenant in their flesh will be cut off for being disobedient. Indeed, all the nations that are produced from your circumcised flesh shall be born into my blood covenant of deliverance. It is your responsibility to guard my instructions and my covenant, Abraham. Behave perfectly, and do not call your wife Sarai anymore, for she is to be raised up and restored in this covenant too, and you will now call her Sarah, which means princess. For I'm about to bless her with a son. Yes, she will give you a son, Abraham, and kings and priests will come from her body." And Abraham fell on his face and cracked up laughing, saying to himself, "How on earth will a child be born to me when I'm 99 years old, or to Sarah who is 90? And Abraham said to Yahuwah, "That's crazy talk. Just let my son Ishmael carry this promise for you. We're way too old to have a child now." But Yahuwah said, "No, Abraham, your wife Sarah is to have a son, and you will call him Isaac, and I will continue my blood covenant with him and with his descendants. And don't worry about your son Ishmael, for I have heard your request, and I know you love him very much. So I will bless him also, and he will be a mighty nation, bringing forth 12 princes. However, I will continue to establish my blood covenant of deliverance through Isaac, who Sarah will give birth to next year." And after Yahuwah had finished speaking, Abraham immediately took his 13-year-old son Ishmael and all of the males of his household, both slave and free, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day, sealing them all through their bloodshed in the blood covenant, just as Yahuwah had commanded. For indeed, this blood covenant of deliverance and relationship, which was once sealed with animal blood to an uncircumcised Adam, Noah, and Abraham, well, it was now made alive through the cutting away and shed blood of Abraham's own flesh as the mediator. For his behavior and obedience pleased Yahuwah greatly in his generation. Abram's covenant involved the blood of animals, but Abraham's new refreshed covenant involved mankind's own blood from their own foreskins. Remember, Alahim's ears are directly linked to the divine life frequency of mankind's blood, making the shedding of it a far more powerful bridging of relationship than just mere animal blood. For sacrifice equals intimacy and love to our Alahim. Remember that standard covenant protocol required shedding of blood, typically animal blood, and the cutting of flesh, typically animal blood too, and the separating of that cut up flesh into two groups, here with circumcision. The covenant procedure occurred using the male body as the sacrificial flesh. The flesh was cut, blood was shed, and the cut up flesh separated. One part was buried in the ground, that's the foreskin, and the other remained on the body. Quite literally, Abraham and his male descendants wore this covenant and were in this covenant. They bore the signs of it in their flesh. The penalty for refusing the circumcision covenant was very stern. You were to be cut off from your people. This was both spiritual and literal. When a male descendant of Abraham refused the circumcision, or when a parent refused to have their boy child circumcised on the 8th day after birth, well, they were physically separated from their clan, and they were spiritually separated from Yahuwah. They were no longer Hebrews and could claim no right to any of Yahuwah's promises. This is why Paul explained that what Alahim really wanted was circumcised hearts, not circumcised flesh. He wants our hearts to accept and wear the blood covenant that came to us at so great a price, Yahusha's blood. At our spirit baptism, our hearts are circumcised, and we are very literally accepting Alahim's blood covenant protocol upon ourselves. And now we find ourselves in the same position as Abraham. Either we are circumcised by accepting the new covenant, which is the blood of Yahusha, or we refuse it. And if we accept it, we are accepted as part of his bride. But if we refuse, well, we are cut off and separated. So by these comments, we see how important the rite of circumcision was, especially when it was raised up with Abraham. No one was entitled to the promises or privileges in the Abrahamic covenant without being circumcised. They were literally cut off from the people of Alahim. No circumcision meant they had broken the covenant or were not in covenantal relationship with the one true living Alahim. So circumcision had great spiritual and covenantal significance. From this time on, and in due time, all nations would be divided into two ethnic groupings: the chosen nation of Israel and all other outside nations, or goyim, which we would call Gentiles today. Paul specifies these two ethnic groupings as the circumcision and the uncircumcised in his day, or Jews and Gentiles. Three things were involved in the rite of circumcision, these three main things. 1, the cutting off of the foreskin flesh of the male reproductive organ and the shedding of blood because of it, by reason of the instrument used. 2, the rite took place on the 8th day after the male child's birth. And 3, the naming of the child also took place at this time. Remember these 3 points because we will come back to them. These things had great significance in the mind of Alahim, even if the sons of Abraham did not fully understand them at the time. Because when this threefold act of circumcision was accomplished, the child was officially in covenantal relationship with Yahuwah Alahim and other circumcised seed, and he was an heir to the promises and privileges of the Abrahamic covenant. Life is in the blood and comes from the seed or sperm of the man, which would now pass through the covenant cut and blood sealed phallus into the womb of a woman, thus multiplying the nation and the promise given to Abraham through covenant relationship. So important was this rite that Yahuwah sought to kill Moses even after calling him, for he had failed to bring his own sons into covenant relationship. And later, Moses even said that he was a man of uncircumcised lips, revealing again more of the true fulfilled nature of circumcision in relation to new hearts and behavior. A man of uncircumcised lips, the way we speak, the way we behave, the way we think, what comes out of our bodies. So let's look at the covenant given to Moses. In Exodus 12, Yahuwah charged Moses concerning the keeping of the feast of Passover. This is just before they left Egypt. No Israelite and no stranger among them could eat of the Passover unless they were circumcised, meaning that they were in covenant. It should be recognized that circumcision was originally given to Abraham, not Moses. Circumcision was way before Moses, as we've seen, but certainly re-established and confirmed under Moses after the Exodus. That token or sign of the Abrahamic covenant was incorporated and continued on into the Mosaic covenant, as we saw in Leviticus 12. The Jews in Yahusha's time almost overlooked this fact and even exalted circumcision as originating with Moses, rather than origination with Abraham by Yahuwah. Yahusha reminded them of this in John 7 when he said, "Moses therefore gave you circumcision, not because it is of Moses, but of the fathers," meaning it was from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The problem in Acts chapter 15 at the Jerusalem Council is the same because the religious teachers tried to make Gentile believers go through the rite of circumcision in keeping with the law of Moses in order for them to be delivered. The Galatian assembly experienced this same trouble over the matter of circumcision, and this is what Peter and Paul had to settle in Jerusalem. However, under Old Covenant times, Gentiles who became proselytes to the faith, which just means they converted and joined into the covenant of Israel, well, they certainly underwent the external rite of circumcision back then. Some did this voluntarily, and others were forced to do so in unscrupulous manners, thus making the rite of circumcision a distorted and a despised thing. The tragic thing is seen in the fact that Israel and Judah missed the whole spiritual truth and experience of circumcision, while holding on to the physical fact and external ritual experience of the rite. So now that we've seen circumcision in the covenant given to Abraham and the covenant given to Moses, let's look at Yahusha's new covenant and what circumcision means for us today. So what then becomes of circumcision under Yahusha's new covenant? Does it continue on from Abraham into Moses and now on into the new covenant? The answer is 1000% in the negative. Never, no, not at all. Circumcision is fulfilled in Yahusha, taken to the torture stake, and there finished and fulfilled regarding its physical, religious, external, fleshly value and acceptance for righteousness. It is finished, never to be lifted up again. However, in the torture stake, something truly marvelous occurs. For this rite of circumcision takes on its proper, true, and spiritual significance, which actually makes it everlasting, which was promised to Abraham in an everlasting covenant. So what happens at the stake actually makes this everlasting. For of course the physical, fleshly, temporal aspects, well, they all passed away, as did the people. But the spiritual alone is eternal and can never pass away. So let's see why these things are so. Firstly, let's look at the circumcision of Yahusha himself. Yahusha, as a baby, physically experienced the rite of circumcision on the 8th day when he was named according to the angel's word before his birth. Paul said that any man who was circumcised was a debtor to do the whole Torah law. So when Yahusha, born under the old covenant, was circumcised, well, he was committed as a debtor to do the whole Torah law. And this he did. He did all the Torah. He never broke one single Torah law. He did it all, fulfilled it all. He came and was born under the law in order to redeem them that were also under the law. But his physical circumcision pointed to a greater circumcision yet to come. his circumcision of the stake. There is no doubt about that which took place relative to the torture stake, for it was the greater circumcision which Yahusha experienced, for there he was cut off for our sins. In Colossians, Paul speaks of it as the circumcision of Messiah. And he is not talking about that physical circumcision of Messiah as a baby of 8 days old. No, he's talking about Yahusha's body of flesh that was broken for our sins, and his perfect divine blood that was shed for our forgiveness. This was the real circumcision that Yahusha underwent, a cutting away. His resurrection took place at the end of the seventh day Sabbath, in the early morning hours of the 8th day, right between the 7th and 8th day. Yes, he technically arose late at night as the 8th day begun, ushering in a new week. And after a short post-resurrection ministry, he was ascended on high and exalted to receive a new name, Yahusha Alahim. So, circumcision in relation to Yahusha Messiah was fulfilled both physically and redemptively right here. And as you can see in this diagram, Yahusha fulfilled this rite. Number 1, flesh and blood rite, cut off in circumcision, the physical act of circumcision. Yahusha fulfilled it. Flesh and blood rite, cut off at Yahusha's death. That was what he did. It was performed on the 8th day. Yahusha was resurrected on the 8th day. And at circumcision, the child was given his name, and Yahusha was given a new name, a new title, a new ranking. He is Yahusha Alahim. This is the name spoken of in Revelation, a new name. The physical fleshly rite of circumcision, as to its new covenantal value, was fulfilled and finished at the torture stake of Yahusha Messiah. For at the stake, circumcision moved into the higher and spiritual level of experience. This is seen in the revelation given in both Old and New Covenants. So now that we've seen circumcision in the life of Yahusha and what he did at the stake, let's look at the circumcision of the true believer. The true and spiritual meaning of circumcision is that of the heart. Writings under both Old and New Covenants affirm this truth. The Jews hung on to the physical aspect and missed the spiritual aspect. They tried to impose the physical fleshly ordinance onto the Gentiles, glorying in the flesh and not in the spirit. So let us consider the important scriptures concerning this in Old and New Covenant times. Firstly, in the Old Covenant, in Deuteronomy 10, Yahuwah told Israel to circumcise therefore the skin of your hearts, and be no more stiff-necked. He promised in Deuteronomy 30 and Leviticus 26 that he would circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed, to love Yahuwah your Alahim with all your heart and with all your being, that you may live. So we can see this covenant, the seeds of this covenant were being planted right back here in Deuteronomy. Even just in fleshly ordinance, he wanted to circumcise their hearts, the skin of their hearts, to love him. In Jeremiah 32 and Ezekiel 11 and 36, such great prophetic words were given to those already circumcised in the flesh. Yahuwah lamented through Jeremiah that Judah was uncircumcised in heart, though already circumcised in the flesh, and that he would punish both the uncircumcised with the circumcised. The circumcision in the flesh was, of course, Judah, or what we would call Jews today. They were already circumcised in the flesh, but he was going to punish them as uncircumcised because of their heart behavior, their heart attitude. And of course, the uncircumcised back then were the Egyptians, Edomites, Ammonites, Moabites. Yet Yahuwah saw the heart, not the flesh. He saw the heart. So when we look into Alahim's mind through his words, we see that both Jews and Gentiles were all uncircumcised before him, one in the flesh and the other in the heart, and they would all be punished likewise, thrown in together, unless something divine took place. Now in the New Covenant, Paul is the one who gives the fullest and clearest interpretation of the circumcision of the heart. For the New Covenant times, circumcision becomes uncircumcision if the Jew fails to keep the law, while uncircumcision becomes circumcision for a Gentile if he keeps the royal laws of love, being a fulfillment of all Torah and prophets. Therefore, a Jew is not one outwardly by circumcision of the flesh. In Romans 2, Paul states that a Jew is one inwardly by that circumcision of the heart. And in Romans 4, Paul shows that Abraham is the father of all believe, whether circumcision or uncircumcision. But how is that possible, looking at the great effort Yahuwah went into to ensure that his chosen promised people coming into the covenant were all circumcised? How can that be? How can it not matter whether they're physically circumcised or uncircumcised? And how can Abraham be this example? Why? Because Abraham believed Alahim. This was the key. He knew and believed and walked, was a friend of Alahim. He believed Alahim while he was still uncircumcised. When he came out of Babylon, he believed. While he was still a Gentile, he believed. While he was still uncircumcised, or still a Gentile physically, his heart had already received and believed the first part of the covenant given to him by Yahuwah Alahim. So it was actually Abraham's heart that was circumcised before his flesh. That's why he followed. And then over 13 years later, as we saw, he received the sign and the seal of circumcision because he believed and trusted Yahuwah's words. It was not about the fleshly circumcision, it was about the belief and the following. And Abraham's trusting belief was attributed to him as righteousness. Can you see the issue here is the heart belief, not the fleshly circumcision. We have a whole nation and a whole religion of people, many religions, who insist on circumcision in the flesh, but they do not believe in Yahusha. So how can it be a fleshly issue? It is a heart issue. So, whether Jew or Gentile, circumcised or uncircumcised, if they believe, well, they become the seed of Abraham through Yahusha's blood, because we're not associating with his physical flesh and the circumcision of the flesh. We are associating with the heart circumcision and Abraham's belief. That is the association here. For the issue is the trusting belief, not the physical circumcision or uncircumcision. And indeed, all those who are in Yahusha are the seed of Abraham, and they inherit the promises given to Abraham through Yahusha Messiah and his work on the torture stake. So it's not about our association with Abraham, it's about our association with the one Abraham was searching for, the one Abraham pointed to through his nation, through his people, through bringing forth the seed of Yahusha Messiah. That's who we associate with, that's who we are delivered through. And his work on the torture stake. It's all about his new covenant divine blood, not the old covenant animal and foreskin blood, which we can see in retrospect now. It was merely a shadow and could never truly deliver a person and give them eternal life. So to the Galatian believers, Paul writes that circumcision profits nothing. If a man is circumcised, he is a debtor to do the whole law, or he comes under the curse of the law. He says in Galatians 5 that in Messiah Yahusha neither circumcision nor uncircumcision avails anything, but belief that works by love. He tells them to stand fast in the liberty and freedom wherewith Yahusha has made them free. And he rebukes those religious Jewish teachers who glorified the flesh. They did not keep the law themselves, yet they tried to enforce circumcision on the believing Gentiles coming into Yahusha's reign. And Paul reiterates this again in Galatians 6, that in Yahusha neither circumcision avails anything, not uncircumcision, but a new creature. As many as walk by this rule, peace on them. Now Peter was recognized as the disciple to the Jews, or the circumcision, and Paul, the disciple of the Gentiles, the uncircumcision. Both Peter and Paul came to the recognition that neither state mattered to Yahusha. In the flesh, neither state, circumcised or uncircumcised, it didn't matter to Yahusha. It was the circumcision of the heart that counted. To the Philippians, Paul writes, "For we are the circumcision who worship Alahim in the Spirit and rejoice in Messiah Yahusha and have no confidence in the flesh." And Paul warns them of the Judaizing religious dogs or evil workers and the concision. He writes to them as a circumcised man, yet realizes that there is no spiritual value in such before Yahusha, and that one is not counted righteous or delivered by this physical act. And again, even though Paul had Timothy circumcised because of the Jews and what they would say, he would not consent to having Titus circumcised. So it seems that Paul did this with the idea of becoming all things to all men, so that he might win some, not because he believed in the practice any longer, but so that he would win some. Be like a Jew to win the Jews, and be like a Gentile to win the Gentiles. Be all things to all people. Don't use your freedom to sin, but be free. He who the Son sets free is free indeed. In Colossians, Paul links circumcision with the idea of baptism. Interesting, in Colossians, Paul links circumcision with the idea of baptism for the believer, as well as the work of the torture stake. The believer is circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, because it is an operation of Yahusha Alahim by the Spirit upon the heart. Not in water, but by the Spirit on the heart. The body of the sin of flesh is put off by the circumcision of Yahusha, that is, by the cutting off on the torture stake and the shedding of his precious blood. Interesting, Paul links circumcision with the idea of baptism. So combining the shadows of both circumcision and baptism, combining both these ordinances, fleshly circumcision and water baptism, let's combine them. We can see what John the Baptist said regarding the type of immersion or baptism required, can't we? John said, "I baptize you in water, but the one coming after me, whose sandal straps I'm not even worthy to tie, he will baptize you in spirit and fire." And this concept of baptism was what Paul linked with circumcision. So combine all this, fleshly circumcision and water baptism, combine all this together, and what do we come up with? What do we come up with? In Yahusha Alahim's new covenant baptism of spirit and fire, we are buried with him, cut off with him, in spirit, and then risen with him through trusting belief in the operation of his deliverance vein. What? Yes, in other words, when Yahusha reveals himself to us and we see who he is, and we see how we've lived before him all our lives, we repent and we are cut, not cut to the flesh, but cut to the heart, pierced, shattered, broken, severed, desperate, and sorry. We experience just a portion of that cutting off, that cutting and severing that he experienced on the stake. We do not enter an old fleshly covenant through fleshly circumcision. No, we enter a new covenant through a spiritual circumcision not made with hands. A circumcision of the heart is needed, For this is a heart issue, a heart condition. We have all been born with a corrupt seed in our heart, which has ruined and shaped our whole lives. So in order to be truly delivered, we need that corrupt seed and the wicked heart it resides in. We need it cut out. We need it circumcised, whereby we receive a new heart and a new spirit in order to access the new reign of Yahusha's kingdom. Indeed, our hearts are the divine real estate, the set-apart property that Alahim requires. Yahusha wants our hearts. He wants us as his bride. The promised land is now us, his lively stones, which are going to be fitted together to form the new royal city. So through our belief in the work of Yahusha's death on the torture stake, we partake of him. We enter his body and his blood beyond the veil, as he is the narrow gate for the sheep to enter for life. He is the narrow gate, and when we enter his vein, we become a new creature. And just as Yahusha walked, we too are taken through a process of suffering, a process of death of our fleshly self and that spirit within that controls us. And when we are dead, when we are buried and finally sold over to Yahusha, then he resurrects us. He transforms us through his new covenant circumcision. It is of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the flesh or of the letter. Therefore, in conclusion, all heritage, all adoption and intimate covenant relationship given to Abraham's family through circumcision, this is transformed in Yahusha Alahim's work on the torture stake, and it finds its spiritual fulfillment in the narrow gate, in the vein of deliverance, whereby man and woman can become new creatures to behave his royal laws of love and his fruits of righteousness, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, humility, and self-control. Against such there is no law. For these behaviours are the true sign and the true seal and the true proof of our deliverance. When people see the change and they feel the love from us, they will know Yahusha in us. This work is done in the Spirit, for the flesh profits nothing. Therefore, all in Yahusha Alahim are the seed of Abraham through the promise, and there is no longer Jew nor Greek, circumcision nor uncircumcision, slave nor free, but Messiah is all and in all. It is all because of his life, his body, and his blood that we can know him and be delivered. Nothing we can do in our fleshly heritage or frail human existence can matter. It is all about the divine heart operation and what's going on inside us, which produces the behavior from these new living temples. The true spiritual experience of spirit and fire baptism is the new covenant circumcision of the heart, a divine heart operation. It is for this reason that both the uncircumcised in heart and the uncircumcised in flesh, in Ezekiel's temple vision, they both had to pass through the torture stake and be transitioned into spiritual reality. So ever since the torture stake of Yahusha Alahim, it is only the spiritual circumcision in the heart that fulfills the everlasting covenant of circumcision made to Abraham. The stake truly is the key to coming out of covenantal confusion, both then and today. It is through this practice of spiritual circumcision, through a spirit baptism and a fire baptism, that the covenant is made eternal, because it is made eternal on spiritual reality and spiritual promises. Nothing of old in the flesh could last. The people and the covenant were broken and died. But today in Yahusha Alahim we are raised up new, as new creatures in a new covenant through spirit and fire, so we can transition into the perfection and the maturity of the wilderness existence, waiting for Yahusha, who's on his way, and he arrives in a few short years. So get ready, brothers and sisters. Get your heart clean, get your life clean, so that he can dwell in you and you can know him and you can be considered a good and faithful servant. Thanks, brothers and sisters.